intentions. And at some point soon, I'm going to share my screen and just to so I can show you the suttas that I'm reading, and you can read them along with me, and some brain pictures and things at various points, or pictures of experiments. But please don't hesitate to interrupt me or stop and ask a question or make a comment. So feel free to unmute yourself and raise a point or a question. So it's probably important to say what I mean by intention, or in what sense of that word do I want to be talking about. And it's really the broadest sense of intention. That is not just, I think in the narrow sense, at least in our language group, we think about the word intention in English meaning something that we've thought out and we plan to do. And that's certainly a type of intention, like maybe you're thinking about New Year's resolutions or something, and those are intentions. But I do want to mean it in a broader sense, to include more subtle kind of background intentions that might be associated with habits. You're not fully cognizant of the intention when it arises, but it leads to behaviors or just inclinations to act a certain way, or impulses, instinctive reactions. These all can broadly be thought of as being associated with intentions arising in the mind, sometimes clearly conscious and aware, and sometimes sort of on the fringe of awareness, not easily named or even recognized. So a broad sense of intentions. And I mean, it's once one starts paying attention to intentions, it's clear that they're really central to Dharma practice. The dukkha, the sort of unnecessary suffering that we add to our experience and makes things worse, arises from not from what happens, but from how we respond to what happens. And so it involves intentions that give rise to behaviors or of thought, speech, or body, speech, or mind. And in people who are relatively free in their minds, they respond without making things worse. And virtuous behaviors like ethical behaviors, the silas, or compassion and kindness and friendliness, the Brahma Viharas in general, these arise from intentions, wholesome intentions that don't make things worse, that make things, if anything, better. And really, that's from the perspective of some teachers, this is what the fruit of Dharma practice is a transformation of how intentions arise in the heart and in the mind. Gil Fronsdal has a book called The Issue at Hand. And one of the chapters in that book is called Mindfulness of Intentions. And I'm just going to read to you some of the things that he says about the value of this kind of practice. Excuse me. He says, one of the most direct ways to bring ease and happiness into our mindfulness practice and into our lives is by investigating our intentions. And he says, the greater our awareness of our intentions, the greater our freedom to choose. Mindfulness, by helping us notice our impulses before we act, gives us the opportunity to decide whether to act and how to act. Our intentions, whether noticed or unnoticed, whether gross or subtle, contribute either to our suffering or to our happiness. So many benefits from having a clearer awareness of our intentions as they arise. I'm going to share my screen and just share with you some suttas. And oops. Oh, oh, I see. There we go. I'm going to just assume that someone will alert me if the screens I'm trying to share doesn't show up or isn't what I'm not. If I'm talking about one thing and something else is on the screen, please let me know. But I think it's proper. So this I love this very concise and pithy quote from the Penetrative Sutta, where the Buddha says, in the middle of some other key insights about the Dharma, he says, an intention, I tell you, is karma, is kama. Intending, one does kama by way of body, speech, and intellect. And the Pali word that he uses there, that's in the sutta, is cetana, which is most frequently translated as intention. So clearly, with this statement, he's saying that our intentions are the key thing about how karma unfolds. It's not so much the outcome of our actions. If if you're trying to make a nice meal for people and you're doing your best, and the souffle doesn't rise, that's not great, but it's not bad karma. I mean, if you were purposely trying to make a crummy meal, that would be having a negative effect on your on the rest of your mind stream when you intend bad outcomes. So it's not the outcome, it's the intention that's critical. This is another, not a sutta, but a Buddhist teaching from the Zen tradition, a book in Chinese, from the Chinese Zen tradition called the Blue Cliff Record. A monk asked Yun Men, the patriarch at the time, "What is the teaching of a lifetime?" And Yun Men replied, "An appropriate response." So how we respond to what's happening around us, which is a function of the intentions that arise in us, this is the crux from this Zen perspective, the crux of the practice. A lot of times, when we talk about intention in 21st century English, people think of more the cognitive intentions, the things that they're very well aware of, what I intend or plan to do. But the Buddha makes it clear that he's speaking more broadly. This sutta is called the Cetana Sutta, or the Sutta on Intention. And in Sujato's translation, the Buddha is saying, mendicants or monks, what you intend or plan and what you have underlying tendencies for become a support for the continuation of consciousness. And then later he says, if you don't intend or plan, but still have underlying tendencies, this becomes a support for the continuation of consciousness. And he's talking about the concepts related to dependent origination, but the point he's making is it's not just these sort of obvious, fully conscious, deliberative plans we make that are critical for our practice and our well-being. It's also the underlying tendencies, the things we might be less aware of, impulses and inclinations that arise on the fringe of our awareness. These also have the same karmic effect. Here's another sutta called the Vedhavitaka Sutta, or the Sutta on the Two Kinds of Thought. And this is a sutta where the Buddha, one of the few where he talks about things that he learned before he woke up, before he he was fully freed. He says, "Mendicants, before my awakening, when I was still unawakened but intent on awakening, I thought, why don't I meditate by continually dividing my thoughts into two classes?" And then the sutta goes on and he talks about thoughts that lead to suffering and ill will and delusion, and thoughts that lead to well-being and non-harming and that sort of thing. And then he summarizes by saying, whatever a mendicant frequently thinks about and considers becomes their heart's inclination. If they often think about and consider malicious thoughts, their mind inclines to malicious thoughts. If they often think about and consider cruel thoughts, their mind inclines to cruel thoughts. Whatever a mendicant frequently thinks about and considers becomes their heart's inclination. If they often think about and consider thoughts of goodwill, their mind inclines to thoughts of goodwill. If they often think about and consider thoughts of harmlessness, their mind inclines to thoughts of harmlessness. So what the actions of the mind, the thoughts, and certainly the actions of speech and body affect the sort of background inclinations, the underlying tendencies of our mind and of our heart. So it's another way of framing the effects of karma. What we do creates who what we're likely to do in the future, who we become in terms of our underlying predispositions. So I really like the sutta, and it's helpful in thinking about the value of recognizing the heart's inclination, being having more than just a minimal awareness of these inclinations in the background of our consciousness. In Gill's book, The Issue at Hand, and his, oh, sorry, I'm not sure why that happened. In his chapter on mindfulness of intentions, he mentions some strategies, and when Gill suggests techniques for practice, I usually pay attention. So one of the things he says is very valuable is to sort of deliberately take some time to reflect on our deepest intentions, those that reflect our best insights, our healthiest intuitions, and our highest values and priorities. Sometimes those are closer to hand, closer to the mind and to consciousness than other times. But if we set aside a little time, it maybe is part of in the beginning of our sitting practice or the end of our sitting practice, to just reflect on those intentions, it creates those inclinations in us. So this is a process of taking a fully conscious and well thought out set of intentions and cultivating them by directing attention to them. And this can affect those sort of background inclinations that also act as intentional processes. Another strategy. So this is kind of like a reflection on the things we've learned that we think are most valuable, as they should inform our intentions. Another strategy is to take a moment before starting a new activity just to reflect on what the intentions are, both to be aware of the intentions that are showing up. It's like you're about to go to the store and you're going to get something, you're going to get some foods, whatever you're going to buy, and be clear about those intentions, and also to connect with the deeper intentions. And he gives an example of just remembering his intention to engage with the people he might run into at the store with compassion and with kindness and with generosity. And just to make that effort to enliven those deeper intentions in anticipation of activities, as well as to discern what are the intentions that are showing up as you begin to do something. And he says mindfulness of intentions while speaking are particularly a powerful practice. that lots of things motivate us to speak or to say certain things or say things a certain way. And I, I think this is a pretty advanced practice to be mindful of those intentions unfolding, so that our higher intentions are reflected in our actions of speech. And Gill also makes the point near the end of his chapter that this practice is not meant to be an effortful kind of continuous monitoring and exhaustive monitoring of what we're doing, or to involve judgment. He says this is really an awareness practice. And awareness, as you know, if you ever try to tell your mind to stop being aware, that you can't. Awareness just happens. It's effortless in its fundamental nature. This is just bringing awareness to the quality of the intentions as they show up. It's not critiquing them. It's just knowing what they are. And especially intentions that are kind of on the fringe of awareness, when they get a little brighter light of consciousness shown upon them, if there's something distasteful about them, they're going to change. You don't have to push them. It's just that we just didn't notice that we had an intention that once we were aware of it, it was kind of unsavory, or just not one we wanted to feed or cultivate. So it's not this hard work or self-judging. It's simply remembering to aim awareness in that direction. Ajahn Suchito has a book called Karma and the End of Karma, and one of his chapters is called Contemplating Intention. And these are just some of the things that he says in that chapter. I really like this chapter of that book. He points out that intention carries a mind state with it, bright or dark, steady or erratic, can be gentle or vigorous. And these states and the feelings that accompany them are food for the heart. Intention is the immediate karma of the mind. And he's pointing out that that intentions create a feeling state. There's Vedana, there's pleasantness or unpleasantness, high or low energy. And this is a point of access to being aware of sort of background intentions, what you might call attitudes or inclinations. And he says, hence, what to look for is not the feeling that arises from sense contact, but that which accompanies intention. Certainly, we do get feelings, pleasant or unpleasant, from sense contact, a delicious meal, a lovely sight. But he wants us to learn to notice the feelings that arise from the intentions that are showing up in our mind, because they have a real quality of Vedana, a real quality of feeling quality to them. And he summarizes this chapter by saying, so the first Dharma accomplishment is that of turning the mind around from holding on to what it receives, through the sense doors, and attending to the roots of how it behaves. That shift allows you to place a simple and direct question into the depths of your mind and heart and nervous system. Is the state or view or program that I'm running taking me into suffering and stress or out of it? I just find this a really useful teaching that, it's not so much what happens to us that affects the quality of our life. It's the intentions that we embody and that underlie our behavior that affects the quality of our lives. And this is something we can do something about. Let's see. Yeah. I guess the other thing I want to say, and I'll show some pictures of brains. This is an embryonic brain. I may have shown this picture before here. Uh, a human embryonic brain. It has three sort of subbrains: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain, and then the spinal cord. And then once it's grown up, mature, this is very early in fetal development. This is a mature human brain. The forebrain becomes really large. The midbrain stays really quite small in mammals, and the hindbrain, it's not huge, but it's bigger than the midbrain, and there's a lot going on there in humans and other mammals. Each of these subbrains has all the circuits that are needed for sensing things in the world, making decisions about what's good and bad for it, and then executing actions. Animals can act from just the hindbrain alone, or the midbrain and hindbrain, or the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. You can show that various levels of the brain are sort of complete, but in different levels of sophistication. The highest level is generally has more sophisticated judgments about what's happening in the world and what we want to do about it and how to do that. And also has the ability to govern the lower parts of the brain. But in most situations, different sort of proto-intentions or pre-intentions start to arise in many different circuits in the brain across these levels. So one that can be prepared to act in a certain way, kind of from a brainstem, hindbrain level, or midbrain level, or a forebrain level. And the forebrain is where the more conscious, deliberated intentions arise from, particularly certain parts of the forebrain that are particularly have ready access to conscious awareness, have language, and are very capable of reasoning. And then there are other lower parts of the forebrain that are a little more driven by intuitions and instincts, and then these lower parts of the brain even more so in that regard. So I guess my point is there are many different kinds of intentions that are embodied in our particular kind of neural architecture. Here's an example of sort of competing intentions arising. And from like the example of someone who's trying to choose what to eat at a certain point, and they've got a Dove bar in the cupboard, and foods like that have a lot of calories and taste good. We've evolved to automatically value those kinds of foods because that's a rare find in the wild. And that's represented in a certain part of the brain. In this case, this ventromedial prefrontal region is where there's an underlying tendency activated to choose these evolutionarily favored rich foods. So that's encoded in a particular sort of primitive part of the forebrain. Now, we can also have a rational reason for choosing a healthier food that's not sort of as instinctively viewed as palatable by the brain, but in our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, an area that's particularly has good access to logic and reasoning and the big picture of what we value, can say, I want to stay healthy. I want to be able to play with my grandchildren for a long time. And that can activate indirectly this more instinctive value representational area, through thought, rational thought. We can say, no, what I really want is to eat something healthy, because then I'll have good things will happen to me that I value very much. So it through the highest sort of most rational part of the brain, we can activate these more emotional parts of the brain and then choose the healthier food. And when we're confronted with the choice, and I'm talking about a study that was published 10 or 12 years ago, where they had people who were about to start a diet go through brain scans, and they showed them pictures of foods, and they had to register how much value they attributed to those foods. And they were told that at the end of the experiment, they would be given one of them to eat. These are just two examples. There were like 40 pairs of things, palatable, unhealthy, or healthy, but not necessarily described as delicious. And they found that when people were able to choose the healthier food, it was because they had activated this region when they saw that healthy food, and secondarily activated this region. And everybody, when they saw the palatable food, activated this region, but only some people activated these two regions both when they saw only the healthy food on the screen. Anyway, that predicted people who could do that did well in choosing healthy foods that they were actually going to be given to eat later. So I think what this illustrates is that often multiple intentions arise in us, and the higher parts of our brain can regulate the lower parts if they're cultivated, if we bring them into awareness and reinforce them, and especially if we can achieve, in this rational part of the brain can achieve a sort of gut feeling that, that actually really is what I want to do, even though it's not sort of instinctive to want to eat broccoli. It is something you do want when you know the consequences. And so if you can activate this gut feeling of valuing down in this lower area, people are successful in choosing the more abstractly valued option. So I'm just going to stop for a second before I go on. Any questions or comments at this point before I launch into another set of sort of sciencey things? Okay, I'll just go on.
I have a question about intention.
Oh yeah.
Do people normally act before the intention is realized?
Oh, that's a great question. And actually, that's what the next slides are about. To some extent, yes. It depends on the type of intention. Some intentions precede the actions, but others are often not noticed until like right before or even at the time of the action. But let me show you a little bit more about that. But what I'm going to show you is the types of intentions that are often not noticed when they arise. But I don't mean to say that all intentions are like that. Many, especially like when you're planning something for the future, like I'm going to do my taxes early this year because my nephew's wedding is on tax day, or something like that. That's you're very conscious of that. You have this intention and it's going to come to fruition at a certain time in the future. But there are other intentions, the ones that happen kind of in the moment, where people are often not aware. And here's an example of that. So this is like an overly simple type of intention, but that's what people often resort to when they try to do an experimental study of it. So this study examined a type of intention that was conceptualized as spontaneous, unplanned. And the idea was, with your dominant hand, tap the tip of your middle finger one time on a tabletop or on the surface, whatever's handy. And then once you've done that a few times, just to be familiar with the movement, then we start the experiment and you give them a start time. And you say, once like 30 seconds have gone by, then at any point, make that tapping movement about 3 times over a period of about 45 to 60 seconds. Doesn't matter when you do it, but don't do it right away. I guess he said at least 10 seconds before you start, but mostly it's more like 30 seconds. Don't plan it. Do it whenever you spontaneously feel like doing it. Just let it arise spontaneously, like one of those background inclinations. So this was a famous study done by Benjamin Libet, and he asked people to do that. He gave them those instructions, but he also asked them to note when they first were aware that they were going to make the finger tap, that the time had come they were going to make the tap now. Note when that intention became conscious. And he had this really clever clock device that this little dot spun around the circle, and the way he measured, had them indicate when they became aware of their intention is he had asked them to say where around this circle was the dot when you became aware of the intention. And this gives him a resolution of like almost 40 milliseconds of accuracy, of precision of when people became aware of their intention. It's kind of a clever technique. And then he hooked the people up, the volunteers up, with an EEG array around their scalp, because you can measure the motor part of the brain getting ready to make the movement and then actually making the movement. You can see when the brain is starting, when the intention has changed what the brain is doing. And here's what they found on sort of on average, that so this, where it says EMG, electromyogram, that's where the finger moved. And they had little electrodes on the finger so they could tell when it moved. And then 200 milliseconds before, W, that's when people became aware of the wish to move or the intention. That's the time they indicated they were aware that they were going to move. And then 200 milliseconds later, their finger moved. But the brain started the movement 500 milliseconds before the movement occurred. That's half a second. So this all is happening very quickly, but the movement is beginning to be launched. It takes a while for it to actually get executed, but the beginning of it starts 500 milliseconds before. 300 milliseconds later, or 350, I guess, I forget what so it looks like 300. Anyway, is when the average person was aware that intention was becoming manifest. And then they would move at time zero here. I've just described this. It's called the readiness potential. It's an EEG signal that you can detect that the brain is getting ready to move, to make a movement. So this study attracted a lot of attention. It was discussed in terms of free will. Do we really not have free will? We start doing things before we even know we're going to do them. And these are it's good questions. I think not really relevant from a Buddhist perspective, because that's not a critical question. We try to cultivate healthy intentions. We don't debate whether there's a self doing them or not. But in terms of the free will question, the one thing that was really clear in these experiments, and it's been replicated many times, is people could stop the movement. They could veto the movement. They could override it and not make the finger move as soon as about 75 milliseconds before the finger moved. So you could see when the resting potential arised and when people were aware they were going to move. But if a little red light came on, a little stop sign came on, people could not move. They could very quickly and deliberately freely choose to veto the action. And I do think that this is relevant to some of the benefits of mindfulness practice, is that it gives us a little more time to be aware of what we're about to do and then choose maybe not to do it. And so there is this access to our higher centers. They can override maybe what might be an ill-advised impulse that's arising from lower centers. There's plenty of time for the higher centers to override those things if we're aware of them, and that's where mindfulness gives us a real advantage. Now, a lot of people lately have been curious about what this sort of lack of awareness of our intentions until pretty late in the process for certain kinds of intentions, these subtle background spontaneous actions. What that means about the mind, and one group was studying hypnosis, and they did this same study, slightly different methods, but the same principle. And they predicted that what makes some people easily hypnotized is that they don't really notice their own intentions. So the classic test of how hypnotizable someone is you induce a hypnotic trance and you tell them to do something like that their hand's going to float up into the air of its own accord, and that's a hypnotic suggestion, and the stage hypnotists have people like cluck like a chicken or do silly things. They carry out actions and they feel like they're not intending to do them. So anyway, these psychologists thought that probably the people who were very easily hypnotized were particularly unaware of their intentions. And so they could mistake them as the hypnotist's intention, not their own. And in fact, the highly hypnotizable group here on the left, they weren't aware of their intention to raise their finger in this. They didn't hypnotize these people. They just they have a way of measuring how hypnotizable someone is, and they did that. They put them into 3 groups, and the people who were measured as highly hypnotizable, when they did this finger tapping experiment and asked them when they were aware, it was after their finger already moved. So it was like 25 milliseconds after their finger had already moved. People who were sort of medium hypnotizable was maybe 60 milliseconds before, and people who were very low hypnotizable was 100 milliseconds before. Now, they use a slightly different method, so the times aren't identical to in the earlier experiment, but clearly there was a relationship between how aware someone is of the intentions that arise in the background and how hypnotizable they are. Now, they added on us another group, which was people who were regular mindfulness practitioners and had a practice of at least 2 hours a week of mindfulness sitting practice, and for several years. And these people had the longest, the earliest awareness of this subtle intention arising, a statistically significant difference compared to sort of the average person in their hypnotizable group. So this sort of, to me, confirms what seems evident just from practice, that one can become more aware of intentions by developing mindfulness skills. There's another way this same question has been looked at by the same group. There's a task that measures a phenomenon called intention binding effect. So they're given a button to press and a little clock to estimate the timing of things, and the button is electrically connected to a bell, and there's a lag time of 250 milliseconds, a quarter of a second, between pressing the button and the bell ringing. And they ask them to in the same sort of unplanned way, spontaneously, without really planning, when you feel like it, press the button, and then notice on the clock when the bell rings. And the right answer would be 250 milliseconds after you've pressed the button, because that's how it's always exactly that. But people, average people, think the bell sounds sooner than it actually did sound, like 60 milliseconds sooner. And this is just a normal thing. And that doesn't happen if the bell is, if there's no button connected to the bell. It only happens if they think they're causing the bell to ring. So when we intend an action and then observe the action, we distort our perception of when the action occurs. So it's closer to when we press the button than it really was. There's this kind of like a magnetic attraction. It distorts our time sense. And the more aware we are of our intention, the stronger this intention binding effect is. And so in a group of meditators, they said the bell rang a lot sooner, like more than twice as much earlier. And they interpret this as evidence that these mindfulness practitioners were had a clearer awareness of when their intention arose. And so that sort of pulled their time perception of the bell ringing closer to when they pressed the button. So there's evidence from a number of different studies showing what we sort of know from practice, that cultivating mindfulness gives us more insight into the intentions that are arising in our mind. So there's a part of the brain that is probably particularly good at noticing intentions, and it's what's called the dorsal pathway of the brain, which is illustrated by this black arrow here, and here's the ventral pathway. This is for vision. There are these pathways for our three major senses: seeing, hearing, and touch, body sense. And they both have, all three of those senses have a dorsal and a ventral stream or pathway for perceiving through that sense door. And the dorsal pathway in every case is more adept at perceiving our intentions. And I'll try to explain why that is. And I've talked about this before, but I'm going to talk about it again. So the ventral, which is not so good at seeing intentions, is designed for cognitive and abstract kind of perceptions, whereas the dorsal, perceptions for action. So the ventral stream of vision, for example, is really good at identifying objects. This is a mushroom that's not edible, and it's important to know that. This is a large carnivore that we should be very careful about getting too close to, if you can see that animal there. So this dorsal stream, I should say the ventral stream, can see what things are, identify objects, and understand abstractly what category they belong to and what to do about it. The dorsal stream takes in a whole situation and allows you to easily intuit what you should do in that situation. Turn around and go back. That's too steep of a hill for me to ski down, or ski to the left and then the right, and you make a plan of action. That the dorsal stream of vision in this case is framed by our intentions. We'll size up this situation in terms of what we're going to do. And a simpler kind of thing, I'm going to move my hand and turn my hips a certain way so I can catch this frisbee as it comes to me. You see where it is and you interpret its meaning in terms of what you're going to do. So it's intrinsically related to intentionality. All animals, all mammals anyway, have the capacity to do both these things, but humans have sort of an ordinary development of this dorsal stream, this perception for action. It encodes how close things are, how far away, how fast they're moving, what else is in the situation, just like other animals. But the human ventral stream is really highly sophisticated. We can detect very subtle changes in shape and color and many categories we recognize. It's really well suited to language, and written language is the epitome of that. If you were a Sumerian, your ventral stream would be able to read those Sumerian characters. And this is the anatomical, the part of our nervous system devoted to that kind of processing is rather large in humans, unlike other mammals. And in some ways, we let that kind of perception of the world and that kind of thinking about the world dominate our mental life because it's so highly developed in us. But this other thing is the kind of awareness that's more intuitive, that is a point of access to feeling what our intentions are, maybe in a nonverbal way, but in an intelligent way, a way that's can usefully guide our decisions about whether to go on with that intention or not. Although it might take us a while to put that stuff into words, because language is really a development of the ventral stream. And where these streams terminate is informative. The dorsal stream, where it ends up is in the frontal lobe, in the parts of the frontal lobe that are involved in action planning, and formulating conscious intentions. Where the ventral stream ends up is in part of the temporal lobe that's involved in language and semantics, categorical recognition of categories. So just to review, the dorsal stream supports action, the ventral stream supports abstraction, cognition, big picture, specific focus, situations and contexts versus individual objects. This is more process oriented, this is more content oriented. The dorsal stream, it's not unconscious. It's just not the foreground of awareness. It's usually in the background of awareness. And it takes a certain type of skill, the kind that mindfulness cultivates, to appreciate it a little more clearly. You have to declutter the foreground to appreciate the background sometimes. The content of this kind of consciousness is less easily verbalized. I mean, you can put words on it, but sometimes a single word captures the gist of what's in the ventral stream, because that language is really built around those categories. Yeah. So as I said, it's the dorsal stream that's framed by the intentions, not necessarily our planned or our aspirational intentions, but the ones that are active in the moment as we're sizing up a situation. Those are the actionable intentions. Whereas the ventral stream processing is framed by our prior knowledge, the things we already know about the world, how to recognize a mushroom of one type or another, or that sort of thing. Well, I'm going to go over this quickly. I think I might have shown these pictures before. You can look at these objects, common objects, and you see them with both your ventral and your dorsal stream. If the question is, what are these things? That's a ventral stream question. This is a blue plastic metal egg beater, a green plastic watering can. That's a ventral stream. What is it? What can you do with these objects? That's a dorsal stream. You immediately understand you can crank it with this thing. You can stabilize it with that handle with one hand and crank it with the other. And then, you can make whipped cream. If you're going to water your plants, you grab it here, you put the water in here, and you can water your plants with it. So what the dorsal stream perceives are affordances, parts of the object that you can interact with. And these are related to the intentions that you might have. Let's see. Let's see. This is just a common illusion. Those two circles look the same until I put some other circles around them, and now this one looks larger. And I'll just do it again. With no context, they look identical. With context, they look different. And this is an illusion that happens in the ventral stream. The category of object, this becomes a relatively large object because it's around relatively small objects. And this is the opposite. But that's a function of object perception. The dorsal stream, which is this inactive or action framing perception, isn't fooled. And the way they've tested that is they've made these little discs three-dimensional and asked people to reach out and grab them and measured the distance between their thumb and their index finger. And they used the same grasping aperture for both the disc on the right and the disc on the left. The sort of background awareness of how to hold your hand to grab that thing is not fooled by the illusion of the object's size. So they operate independently, but we tend to pay more attention to the ventral stream, the object abstract-oriented stream. And I've given examples for vision, but these apply to all of our major senses. And it's a really sort of hardwired difference. And in fact, I'll show you a little bit of the wiring that underlies this. Well, actually, before I do that, This is hard to look at. This is a top-down view of the head. Here's the guy's nose and two ears. And these colors are EEG patterns across the entire head. And these are patterns that occurred when you ask people to do that tapping the finger task at a spontaneous time without a plan. And then just as they're starting to move their finger, for both controls and meditators, the standard task, you get a synchronous activation in the dorsal stream. This center part is where the dorsal stream here is, and the ventral stream is around the periphery, on the sides and back. It's lower down, although it's flattened here in this image, so it might be hard to see. It took me a while to learn how to look at these images, but and so they both do it as they become aware of that they're going to move. There's this synchrony in the dorsal stream. They're going to make a movement, and so they have to sort of use that action perception system. But if you ask people to really pay close attention to when the intention arises, I want you to really pay attention to that. The controls can't do that. They don't. They say it's really hard. They don't get synchrony anywhere. But meditators they can do it, and it doesn't confuse them. I guess they sort of know how to pay attention in that way. So I just thought that was kind of interesting that what they found really pointed to the dorsal stream as the place where we can be aware of an intention early before it's even manifest. The eye itself formats information similarly in two distinct ways, and one system in the eye and in the optic nerve is called the retina, and the optic nerve is called the parvocellular system. It's specialized for detecting objects. A single cone cell talks to two intermediate neurons, which talk to a single optic nerve cell in the back of the retina, and that single cell sends this information from one cone cell up into the brain. That's called the parvocellular system, which means small cells. There's a parvocellular optic nerve cell. But there's a different system. Many of the optic nerves, neurons, about 45% of them, are called magnocellular. They're large, and they get information from about 50 rods and cones spread out over the retina. And those 50 rods and cones talk to about 200 intermediate neurons. And there's a lot of conversation going back and forth between these neurons and these rods and cones. And they all feed into one large optic nerve cell. So these magnocellular neurons in our optic nerve are getting information from 250 other cells and distilling it down to information about large features of the visual scene. So the construction, how to construct a situation out of this rather than detect an object. This is the big picture. And these are separate processing streams, just to contrast them again. One is focused on fine details, the other on big picture information. They come up out of the retina into the brain. They cross over so that the left side of your brain sees the right side of space and vice versa. And they come to the thalamus, and they stay separate. The magnocellular and let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. This is just an overview of the optic nerve coming into the thalamus. That's here. And the optic nerve, if you do a cross section of it, all of the parvocellular neurons, the small detailed neurons, are in the center. And all of the magnocellular neurons are in the periphery. There's a concentric segregation of these two channels, and there's no crosstalk between them. It's like we have, each of our retinas is like two eyes, a detail eye and a big picture eye. And they come up into the brain, and when they get to the thalamus, they stay separate. The magnocellular is processed in 2 layers of the thalamus, and the parvo in 4 layers. There's more parvo in humans than in other animals. We have just great detail awareness. They stay separate, and then they go up to the visual cortex, and that's finally they start to pool their information, and then they progress into these ventral and dorsal streams that talk to each other. And once they get to the cortex, there's a lot of constant sharing of information, but still a specialization. These dorsal regions are particularly good at one kind of thing, and the ventral regions particularly good at another kind of thing. But now we have an integration of the two at the cortical level. Anyway, I just wanted to point out that there's this kind of awareness we have that isn't like the center of attention often. And yet we're really good at it. We just have to sort of declutter our awareness a little bit, and then we can sense what's going on there. And, athletes are really good at this. People who have to have very precise movements, dancers, they cultivate that aspect of their awareness, golfers. So I got to wrap this up here. I think that the concept of sampajanya, which is a type usually translated as fully knowing or fully aware, which is part of the instructions in the Satipatthana Sutta, a type of awareness that's encouraged. I think it might be pointing to this kind of background awareness, this contextual awareness. It's a type of non-object focus knowing. Here are some contemporary writers' translations of sampajanya. Bhikkhu Bodhi and Nanamoli translated as full awareness, and the full, I think, corresponds to this broadness. Thanissaro Bhikkhu translates it as clear comprehension. Comprehension includes the suffix prehension, like a prehensile tail. It means grasping, and it sort of points to its connection to our actions, what we're going to do. Sujato translates it straight out as situational awareness, which is a very good description of what the dorsal stream is good at. It constructs situations that we can do something in. And Buddhadasa, one of the most prolific writers in our tradition in recent times, calls it wisdom in action, which is this inactive kind of awareness of intention, really. Analio, in his book on the Satipatthana Sutta, cites the commentaries, and he says there are 4 components of sampajanya that are developed in the later commentaries on the suttas. One is seeing the intention of an action, which is awareness of intention. Seeing the suitability of an action, which to my mind is the action appropriate to this situation. It's a form of suitability means situational awareness to me. Has this element of maintaining sensory restraint in support of mindfulness. I don't really relate that to this mindfulness of intentions or the dorsal stream. Maybe it is in a way, but I don't see it. And then the 4th component is seeing the 3 characteristics, inconstancy, unreliability, and not self, anicca, dukkha, and anatta. And I think that's kind of seeing the situation that human beings find themselves in, a very big picture situational awareness. This is the context of our experience. Let's see.
Can I ask you a question on that last one?
Yeah.
The maintaining sensory restraint, wouldn't that be the veto action?
Oh. Huh. Yeah, perhaps so. Yeah. So that would be a constant. So if you have this kind of situational awareness, you're more able to maintain sensory restraint. You've got the opportunity. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's I find that very useful. Thank you. Yeah. Andy Olinsky talks about sampajanya as referring to a broader, more global awareness of an object as it's viewed in its wider context. And I think this is Joseph Goldstein says, with clear comprehension, which is how he translates sampajanya, we knowing what we're doing and why, a profound and transforming practice. Mindfulness is more than simply being present. We understand the motivations behind our actions. Sorry, I accidentally muted myself. I want to end with the first two verses of the Dhammapada, which Sujato translates this way. Intention shapes experiences. Intention is first. They're made by intention. If with corrupt intent you speak or act, suffering follows you like a wheel, the ox's foot. Intention shapes experiences. Intention is first. They're made by intention. If with pure intent you speak or act, happiness follows you like a shadow that never leaves. Well, I've used up the whole hour again, but I'd be happy to respond to questions if you have questions or comments.
Just one comment I wanted to make was that all of this, what's developed and what we utilize in the mindfulness is motivated or triggered by our values, and that understanding, that whole idea of the ethical, the values, and really being clear about, I don't know what comes first, the chicken or the egg, but seems like really critical in terms of once we understand where this whole process of what gets nurtured and how it gets nurtured and where it goes, of really pausing. Part of intention is to identify our values that are creating our intentions, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's sort of the fundamental thing, and that's where I think that's what Gil was emphasizing in his suggestions, is to take time to reflect on your values and make it easier for them to show up, by directing attention to them. So you remember what they are, and they evolve through our practice, as we have different insights and different experiences, and we get greater clarity about our values. But it's also, I think, important to be more aware of the things that tend to be unconscious, the inclinations and impulses, because then your more deliberate values, your more carefully vetted and considered values have a chance to weigh in if you notice something is coming up that is inconsistent with them.
Isn't it cultivating the, if you cultivate the wise actions, or whatever you want to call the actions, if you try to cultivate those and non-harm, doesn't that kind of go with the flexibility of the mind, the mental processes? Can you change the behavior by cultivating the wholesome? Is that so it becomes reflexive, your reflex rather than your, you don't have to think about it.
Yeah, I think you can make your automatic tendencies evolve toward your higher values by practice, by paying attention, by noticing what the automatic tendencies are, and if the automatic tendency comes onto the work, the desktop of awareness, so to use that metaphor, instead of off on the side, if you can bring it into awareness more centrally, things happen. What awareness is a way for many considerations to weigh in on the decisions about behavior. So reflexive behavior doesn't benefit from that, but behavior that's conscious, voluntary, volitional, deliberate benefits from this kind of committee of the rest of your brain that knows about what you value and what the situation is and how to put those two together, can weigh in if you bring the subconscious impulse to the table of awareness, and I do think that normally you can cultivate those things so that they become more automatic, so that what automatically arises is more characteristic of your higher values.
I always thought of it as changing the groove
Yeah,
in the
exactly.
brain, and that it just intuitively felt like my brain didn't go that way anymore. It didn't go in that direction. It went in a different direction because I cultivated maybe loving kindness or compassion, as it arose, it started becoming cultivated. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
The brain is quite capable of rewiring itself at a very subtle level, and does so all the time throughout life, not just in young people. And it's based on what passes through it.
I'm sorry, I feel like I'm losing a lot though.
Well, yeah.
The older I get.
Yeah. Well, that's true, but we don't lose that plasticity. It's still present. When they've looked at even the oldest of the old, looking at the brain tissue, you can see the markers of that plasticity in everyone.
Well, I thank you, Rick. I always appreciate your coming to speak to us. I really enjoy it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure.
Happy New Year, everybody.
Yeah.
Happy New Year.
I'm going to stop the recording here, and